I never thought a single guest could change my life forever. But when he arrived, everything I believed was turned upside down. At first, I was skeptical, even uneasy. But what he did next, I never saw it coming. Stay with me till the end. You won't believe how this story unfolds. The knock at the door was soft but firm, cutting through the silence of my empty house. I wasn't expecting anyone, at least not really. My hands hesitated on the doorknob, a strange sense of unease settling in my chest. When I finally opened it, I found myself staring up at a man I had only spoken to through messages. Darius. He stood tall, his posture relaxed but unreadable. His dark skin contrasted sharply against the grey sky behind him, and the way he looked at me, calm, steady, made me feel exposed, as if he could see right through me. He wasn't intimidating, but something about him made me unsure. In his hand, he held a single worn-out duffel bag, the kind that had seen years of travel, of life. That was all he brought with him. No excess, no baggage, at least none that I could see. "You must be Jordan," he said, his voice deep but smooth, like he had mastered the art of speaking just enough, but never too much. I nodded. "Yeah, come in." I stepped aside and he walked past me with quiet confidence. His presence filled the space differently than I expected. I had hosted people before, strangers, friends of friends, but something about this felt different. Maybe it was because I had never shared my home with someone who didn't just need a place to stay, but carried an air of mystery I couldn't place. Darius looked around, taking in the space. My house wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place with minimal decor. A few old photographs hung on the walls, books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, and a small couch that had seen better days. "You travel light," I said, trying to break the silence. He smiled slightly, setting his bag down near the doorway. "I learned not to carry more than I need." His words carried weight, but I didn't ask what he meant. I just led him to the guest room, pushing open the door. "It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it." Darius stepped inside, running his fingers along the wooden dresser, as if feeling the energy of the place. He nodded, appreciative but reserved. "This is more than enough." Something about the way he said it made me pause. I had never considered my home to be anything special, but for the first time, I wondered what it looked like through his eyes. As the evening went on, I found myself studying him more than I meant to. He moved with a quiet ease, as if he had been here before, yet there was something guarded about him. He didn't overshare, didn't force conversation. He simply existed in the space, unbothered by my occasional glances. That night, after showing him around, I retreated to my room, but sleep didn't come easily. I could hear him moving, his footsteps light, almost hesitant. I closed my eyes, but a single thought lingered in my mind. Who was Darius? And why did I feel like his presence was about to change something in me? The first few days with Darius were different. He wasn't like any guest I had ever hosted. He didn't just exist in my house, he became a part of it in a way I couldn't explain. He had routines, odd little habits that didn't seem strange at first, but started to catch my attention. Every morning, just as the first light touched the sky, I'd hear the soft creak of the back door. Still half asleep, I would peek through the window, watching him stand in my overgrown backyard, his eyes closed, his face turned toward the sun. At first, I thought he was just stretching or enjoying the morning air, but he wasn't just standing there. He was listening to something I couldn't hear. The way he stood, still as stone, his breathing deep and measured, made it feel intentional, like he was connected to something greater than himself. I told myself it wasn't my business, but curiosity has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. One morning I finally decided to step outside. The grass was still damp with dew, the air crisp and cool. Darius didn't turn when I approached. He just stood there, eyes closed, hands relaxed by his sides. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he just studied me. Then he smiled faintly. "Listening." "To what?" He glanced around as if the answer should be obvious. "Everything." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, pretending I understood. But I didn't. Not yet. As the days passed, I noticed more. Darius had a way of seeing things I overlooked. He moved through the house with an awareness I had never paid attention to, fixing a wobbly chair leg without being asked, adjusting a curtain to let in just the right amount of sunlight, sweeping dust from corners I had long stopped caring about. And then there was the garden. I hadn't touched it in years. It was nothing more than a mess of tangled weeds and forgotten earth. But one evening, as I came home from work, I saw him kneeling there, his fingers deep in the soil, pulling out weeds with slow, deliberate movements. I watched from a distance, unsure of what to say. Finally, I cleared my throat. "You don't have to do that, you know." He didn't look up. "I know." "Then why are you?" Darius wiped his hands on his jeans and met my gaze. "Because things can grow again, if you take care of them." His words hung between us, heavier than they should have been. I didn't reply. I just stood there, staring at this man who had come into my home and, without asking, without forcing, was changing the way I saw it. The strangest part, I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. It wasn't until the storm that everything changed. The weather had been unpredictable for days, the sky shifting from pale blue to dark grey without warning. That evening the wind began howling, rattling the windows and forcing the trees to bend and sway as if they might snap at any moment. I was curled up on the couch, flicking through channels, the storm outside growing louder with each passing minute. And then I heard it, the soft creak of the back door. I froze. The house was eerily quiet, save for the wind. I could tell Darius was up. He had a way of moving around late at night when the world was asleep. But something felt off. I stood and walked cautiously to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see. There he was. Darius was standing outside on the porch, his back straight, his head tilted toward the sky. The rain came down in sheets, soaking him instantly. His clothes clung to his skin, but he didn't seem to care. He wasn't running for cover. He wasn't protecting himself from the storm. He was embracing it. His arms were outstretched, his face lifted as if he were trying to catch the rain, as if he wanted it to wash over him completely. I couldn't look away. I wanted to call out to him, tell him to come inside before he caught a cold. But something kept me silent, a strange pull in my chest that kept me rooted to the spot. The storm raged, lightning flashing across the sky, thunder booming so loud it felt like the whole house might shake apart. But Darius? He stayed there, unbothered, standing tall in the middle of the chaos. When the storm finally started to ease, I expected him to come back inside, but he didn't. Instead, he remained on the porch, his body still, his expression peaceful. It was then that I saw it, a faint smile on his lips, as if he had found something profound in the storm itself. He was at peace with it in a way I could never understand. The door creaked open and I stepped outside, my feet sinking into the wet ground. "Darius," I called softly. He didn't move. "Hey, come inside," I urged, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something deep. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, just calm. "Why do you stand out here?" I asked. "You're getting soaked." He stepped forward slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "The storm isn't something to run from," he said, his voice low but clear. "It's part of the world, part of life. If you hide from it, you miss something." I wasn't sure what he meant. The storm was just a storm, right? But as I stood there looking at him, drenched but oddly content, I realised something was shifting. Something in the way he saw the world was different from the way I had always seen it. "You don't fear the storm?" I asked, more to myself than to him. "No," he replied simply. "I fear what I might miss if I hide from it." I didn't know what to say. I stood there for a long moment, the wind starting to die down, the rain lessening until it was nothing but a light drizzle. Darius stood beside me, his gaze focused somewhere far off, like he could see beyond the storm, beyond the things that scared us. And that's when it hit me. This man, this stranger who had entered my home so quietly, so unobtrusively, was showing me something I didn't want to see. He was showing me how I had spent my life avoiding the things that scared me, the things that made me uncomfortable. I had spent so many years running from the storms, both literal and metaphorical, trying to protect myself from the pain, the uncertainty. But here Darius was, standing in the middle of it all, unafraid, finding peace in the chaos. I hadn't realised it until that moment, but I had been living in fear. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of not being good enough. And yet, here was this man, teaching me how to embrace life, storms and all. When he turned to me, his eyes softer now, he said one last thing before heading back inside. "The storms always pass, but if you learn to stand in the rain, you'll see things you've never noticed before." Those words stayed with me long after he disappeared into the house. I wasn't sure what they meant at the time, but something inside me had shifted. And deep down, I knew I was no longer the same. Something had cracked open in me, just like the storm had cracked open the sky. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was coming, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to face it. As the days passed, it became harder to ignore the transformation happening inside me. Darius had this way of slipping under the surface of my life, slowly pulling back the layers I didn't even know I had hidden. It wasn't something dramatic, not like a sudden epiphany or a loud revelation. It was more like a quiet, steady current that pulled me along without asking permission. It wasn't just the garden or the way he moved through the house with such purpose. It was everything. The way he saw the world, the way he saw me, it was like he could see all the things I had buried deep inside, all the things I had tried to ignore for years. And without even trying, he was gently making me confront them. I couldn't stop thinking about the storm, about his words that night. The storms always pass. But if you learn to stand in the rain, you'll see things you've never noticed before. At first I thought it was just another philosophical idea, something you read in books or hear in movies. But the more I thought about it, the more it began to resonate with me. I had spent so long avoiding the storms in my life, thinking they were things to be feared, things to escape from. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the storms weren't just things to survive, they were things to learn from. I woke up early the next morning, something that had never been a part of my routine. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow through the window. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in my hands, not sure what I was looking for. But something in me felt different. Darius was already up, of course. I should have expected that. He was always the first one up, out there in the yard, doing something that looked simple but felt important. I found him in the garden again, pulling weeds, his hands moving with an almost meditative calm. I watched him for a while, not saying anything, just observing. There was a rhythm to it, like he had found peace in something as simple as pulling weeds. It struck me how much I had taken my own life for granted, how many little things I had overlooked, neglected, or dismissed as unimportant. The simple act of tending to the garden had become something bigger, something I wasn't even aware I needed. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I walked out into the yard, my bare feet pressing into the cool earth. "You're always out here," I said, surprising myself with how much curiosity was in my voice. Darius looked up, wiping his hands on his jeans, his expression soft but knowing. "I like to start the day here. It reminds me that everything, no matter how small, has its place. It just needs time to grow." I nodded, but the words didn't quite sink in until I stood there beside him, watching him work, listening to the sound of the earth being turned over and the quiet crunch of the soil under his hands. I didn't understand it at first, but the longer I stayed, the more I realised that Darius wasn't just working on the garden, he was working on himself. He was showing me, without saying a word, that life was about nurturing what mattered, letting go of what didn't, and having the patience to watch things bloom, even if it took time. That day, I joined him. It was awkward at first. My hands were stiff, unfamiliar with the task. But Darius didn't rush me. He didn't judge. He just worked alongside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. As I knelt there, pulling weeds and turning the soil, I felt something shift inside me. I realised that the garden wasn't just a physical space. It was a metaphor for everything I had neglected in my own life. The things I had left unattended. The things I had allowed to grow wild and out of control because I didn't know how to deal with them. It wasn't just the garden I needed to care for, it was me. The more I worked beside Darius, the more I realised how much I had been avoiding. The unresolved pain from my past. The dreams I had given up on. The relationships I had let slip through my fingers because I was too afraid to put in the effort. I had let them all grow wild, like weeds in the garden of my life. But I didn't have to keep running from it. Just like the garden, everything could be rebuilt. All it took was time, effort, and the willingness to start over. Darius didn't say anything as we worked together, but I didn't need him to. His quiet presence, the way he moved through the world with such intention and patience, was teaching me more than words ever could. By the time the sun was high in the sky, I had pulled up more weeds than I thought I could. My hands were sore, my back aching, but I felt lighter, like I had taken the first step towards something bigger, something I hadn't even realised I needed. "Thanks," I said quietly, turning to him. He smiled, that faint, knowing smile of his. "It's nothing. We're all in this together, you know." I wasn't sure what he meant at first, but as the days went on, I began to understand. Darius wasn't just a guest in my home. He wasn't just some stranger passing through. He had come into my life for a reason, to teach me that nothing, no matter how broken, no matter how wild, was beyond repair. And maybe, just maybe, the same could be said about me. The morning Darius left, I felt a tightness in my chest I hadn't expected. I had braced myself for his departure, knowing it was only a matter of time. But no amount of preparation could prepare me for the feeling of him actually leaving. The house seemed emptier than usual. There were no soft footsteps in the hall, no rustling sounds coming from the garden, no quiet humming as he made coffee. It was as if the life he had brought into my home had vanished with him. I found myself wandering through the rooms, touching things, small details, just to feel like something of him remained. I reached for the framed photograph on the mantel, the one we had both looked at together the day before. It was an old picture of my parents laughing on a beach, and for some reason Darius had asked about it, pointing to the worn-out edges of the frame. "They look happy," he had said. "That's something we all deserve." I stood there for a moment, holding the photo, lost in thought. He had a way of making everything seem important, even the smallest things. He made me realise how much I had overlooked in my own life. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the small note he had left on the counter. It was folded neatly, and as I picked it up, a quiet ache settled in my chest. It wasn't a long message, just a few simple words, but they held so much weight. "Thank you for letting me stay. Remember, things can grow again, if you take care of them." I stood there for a while, holding the note in my hands, feeling the emptiness that seemed to settle over everything. He was gone. And yet, the impact of his time here wasn't something that could be wiped away in a single moment. It was a shift in me that would never go back. I walked outside to the garden, the place where everything had begun. It looked different now, even though the changes were subtle. The weeds had been pulled, the soil turned, the space nurtured. What had once been a neglected patch of earth now seemed alive, vibrant with new possibilities. I knelt down, running my fingers through the rich soil, feeling the coolness beneath my hands. The garden wasn't just a garden anymore, it was a symbol of change, of growth, of everything that Darius had shown me. I realised then that I wasn't the same person I had been when he arrived. And I didn't want to be. Darius had taught me something invaluable, how to face the storms of life instead of running from them, how to see the beauty in the things that seemed small or insignificant, how to nurture what matters, whether it's a garden or a part of myself I had long forgotten. And as I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of what could grow when given attention, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this feeling slip away. I wasn't going to let the lessons he had taught me fade into the past. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see him standing there, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "I'm leaving now," Darius said, his voice quiet but steady. I stood up, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my chest. "I didn't expect you to leave so soon," I said, my voice catching in my throat. He smiled, the same faint, knowing smile he always wore. "I didn't expect to stay this long." I didn't know what else to say. Words felt insufficient, like they could never quite express what I was feeling. But as he walked toward me, he stopped for a moment and looked me in the eye, and I knew, without him saying a word, that he understood. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice soft but certain. "You're already starting to grow." And with that, he was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had been, feeling both a sense of loss and a quiet gratitude. Darius hadn't just left a physical space behind, he had left a new way of seeing the world, a new way of seeing myself. And as I turned back to the garden, something inside me shifted again. The garden was alive with potential, and so was I. I didn't need him to be here to grow, but I would carry the lessons he had given me, and the quiet strength he had shown, with me every day. I would take care of this space, and of myself, in ways I never thought possible. Sometimes the people who change us the most aren't the ones we expect. Watch till the end, because sometimes the real growth begins after they leave.